So with that, I don't want to take a lot of time explaining who Brad is because you probably know, but just experienced entrepreneur, founder, VC. Many of you know him as a blogger and an author. So with that, welcome, Brad Feld.
So thanks for having me. My eyes adjust to the gigantic LED lights shining in. So I'm going to talk for 15 minutes or so. Thanks for turning that down. That was nice. I'll talk for 15 minutes or so about startup communities, and then I'm happy to answer questions and sort of take the conversation wherever y'all want to go. I started thinking about startup communities in a formal sense a couple of years ago. And I want to give you a little intro to how I got to thinking about it. So I grew up in Dallas, and my wife grew up in Alaska. We both went to school in Boston. And I started my first company in Boston in the late 1980s. And I built that company. It was a self-funded company. We built it up to a couple $1 million in revenue, and then it was acquired by I sold it to a public company in 1993. And I was 28. And Boston wasn't home for either me or Amy. And when I sold the company, I said, we had dinner one night, we were talking about what we wanted to do with our life, and I was working for the company that acquired us, but I said, look, by the time I'm 30, we'll be out of Boston. About 2 months before I turned 30, Amy told me that she was moving to Boulder, and I was welcome to come with her if I wanted to. Now, we're married, so this wasn't like, hey, if we want to stay together kind of thing. It was kind of, hey, look, you travel a lot, I'm just going to go live in Boulder, and you're welcome to come with me. We knew one person in Boulder, so there wasn't anything about Boulder other than we'd been there, we thought it was a really cool place. It was in the middle of the country, and at this point, I was making angel investments across the country on the East Coast and the West Coast. As well as sort of in places like Chicago, Seattle, DC, Boston, New York, a little bit in Texas. And Colorado had this kind of interesting appeal of being in the middle of the country. So I figured what I would do is we'd move to Boulder, we'd live in Boulder, and I continued to do what I was doing on either coast, sort of travel a lot, which I continued to do. And if there was anything to do in Boulder, that would be great. So we moved there, and within 6 months, we decided that was home for the rest of our lives. So we found a place where we really wanted to live, which has informed something that I think is really fundamental, which is the previous generations, my parents' generation, probably some people here, your grandparents' generation, had a mindset that you had to travel to where your work was. And you know about the IBM, move every 2 years kind of thing, and the military constantly moving around. I really believe that you should pick the place you want to live and build your life there. So it's a very, very fundamental part of my own belief system. And as part of that, I also believe that you can build significant startup communities and significant entrepreneurial activity in any city in the world. And I don't just believe that you can, I believe it's critically important to the health of cities and the health of society as a whole, because of the diversity of activity, the diversity of thought, and the different things that develop over time. And if you think about it, startups and startup communities are all about renewal, innovation, new things that get tried for the first time. And every city needs this to be happening over a long period of time, because you can have a city crest and start to decline. If you need an example of it, all you have to do is go to Detroit to understand how a city that was once a great, vibrant, growing city became really something that completely fell apart and has hit bottom and has started to rebound, and much of what's causing the rebound is actually startups and startup activities. So I had this sort of thought that I was chewing on in 2010 about what had happened in Boulder, not just since I'd gotten there 15 years earlier, but what was the trajectory, and what were the characteristics, and what were the things that caused the startup community in Boulder to be so vibrant. And for those of you that don't have much context about Boulder, when I would talk about Boulder in 1995, when I said I'm moving to Boulder, people were like, isn't that where Mork and Mindy are from? like that was it. Right? And I started to describe Boulder after I'd been there for a couple of years. I said, look, if you want to understand Boulder, Boulder is where all the East Coast hippies were driving in their VW microbuses across the country to the Bay Area, and the VW broke down and they ran out of gas. And they're like,
So true.
there's plenty of dope. They stayed. And that's what Boulder was. Like, just to give people a sense, it was this really cool, progressive thought, counterculture, hippie-ish kind of place. But it also had this incredible concentration of smart people. It's the best university in Colorado in the middle of town. It has a couple of national labs, so it has a lot of PhDs, and in fact, I believe it's still one of the highest, if not the highest, per capita PhDs in the country. It's 100,000 people, so it's relatively small, but it's 30 minutes away from a 2 million person city in Denver. So it's this interesting, little, beautiful place full of incredibly smart, progressive, counterculture, independent people. When I moved there in '95, there were plenty of startups. I wasn't the first person to be involved in a startup, but there was a very, very diffuse dynamic across the startup community. So there wasn't much cohesiveness. There wasn't any organization. There wasn't really anything that you could put your finger into and say, this is what's going on. There was a lot of tension on the margin. The entrepreneurs thought the couple of VCs in town were idiots, and the couple of VCs in town tried to control the entrepreneurs who thought they were idiots. That doesn't work very well. And you'd hear from people from outside Colorado, oh yeah, we made an investment in Colorado 9 years ago and that didn't work, and whatever. Or you'd hear there's no management talent, there's lots of engineering talent, but no management talent, or there's no sales talent, or everything's storage, because there have been a bunch of storage companies created in Colorado over the years, or Boulder over the years. And when I was looking back in 2010, many of those things had changed. Boulder was now viewed as a nationally recognized startup hub. On a per capita basis, again, 100,000 people, even by 2010, certainly by today, it was the highest per capita concentration of entrepreneurs plus people involved in startups. So if you think about the working population as the denominator, and you think about entrepreneurs and people working for those startups as the numerator, that was the highest number anywhere. It's a really incredible concentration of activity in a very small space. So I started really trying to understand what had happened and looking at some of the history and the dynamics. And then I've had the benefit of the last 2 years, again, of sort of being part of that thought process and really studying it, but studying it while I also looked at the reemergence of startup communities in lots of other places, LA being one of them. If you go back to 2005, 2006, 2007, the startup community here was pretty flat. If you look at Boston, even by 2008, Boston really had not started to reemerge. Or New York, kind of was dead until about 2004, 2005 after the internet bubble, but was starting to reemerge in 2006, 2007, 2008. So by 2010, there was a lot of stuff happening. 2011, obviously, we're now in this period of time where there's a great renaissance. So I consolidated this into thought process, and I came up with 4 principles that I think are at the core of developing a sustainable startup community, effectively a long-term entrepreneurial ecosystem. I want to give you those 4, and I want to spend a little time going into each of them. My hope, by the way, is that in a couple of years, if not sooner, these are totally obvious. So my goal is not that I came up with something totally profound, but that instead everybody sort of looks at these as obvious characteristics of a successful startup community. So the first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. I separate the world of the startup community into 2 categories, leaders and feeders. The leaders have to be the entrepreneurs. The feeders are everyone else. Now it's important to realize that feeders and leaders each have super important roles. One's not better than the other, but they're different. Feeders are things like university, things like government, things like big companies, things like venture capital investors, things like lawyers, things like the accountants, things like any of the service providers around the system, big companies. One of the distinctions is that startup communities and entrepreneurs function in a network world. You're very connected. It's easy to get in touch with me. You don't have to ask somebody permission. Just send me a note, brad@feld.com. All of you in this room have very easy access to each other. Those of you that have companies that are starting to grow, yeah, companies get some hierarchy in them, but they're very flat. You just walk into the CEO's office and you start talking to the CEO or one of the founders about whatever's going on. You have spaces like this that are very egalitarian, where it's very easy to spend time with whomever. That's not how government works. That's not how universities work. That's not how big companies work. They're hierarchies. Right? There's people that have roles, and they have bosses, and they have bosses, and they have bosses. And, right? They run on a time cycle that is linked to that hierarchy. You can't just walk into the CEO's office. So they're different. And they're not better or worse. But anybody who's ever been in a hierarchy that's tried to interface with a network understands how frustrating that is, because it's hard to figure out what to do to it. And anyone on the other side who's in a network that's tried to intersect with the hierarchy knows how frustrating that is. Because you have to go through all this bureaucracy and nonsense and this and that and the other thing. So the really interesting dynamic is that most of the institutions that are feeders are hierarchies. Individual members can play a leadership role in the startup community. But the institutions themselves cannot. When government or university or a big company or a venture capital firm or a law firm tries to be the leader, it squeezes all the energy out of the system. The opposite is true as well. If there aren't enough entrepreneurs, a critical mass of entrepreneurs who play a leadership role, nothing will sustain over time. And when I mean critical mass, I don't mean 500, I don't mean 100, I don't mean 50, I don't even mean 20. A dozen. If it's a smaller town, half a dozen. Number two, the leaders have to go on a long-term journey. They have to have a long-term commitment to the startup community. I define a long-term commitment as 20 years, generational type commitment. But it's not just 20 years from today. I don't describe my 17 years in Boulder as being 17 years on a 20-year journey. I talk about 17 years on a 37-year journey. In 5 years from now, I'll be 22 years on a 42-year journey. You have to continually have this very long view about building a startup community. Startups don't get created in a year or 2 years or 3 years. I mean, they get started, but they don't become successful. Occasionally something does. Most startups take a long time to be successful companies, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Why would a startup community be any different? If you think about many of the feeders, like government, academia, big companies, their time cycles are totally disconnected from the entrepreneur's time cycle. Government runs on 2 to 4 year cycles, and really they only run on 1 to 3 year cycles because of elections. And then it's even a little suspicious as to whether anything will get done in those cycles. Big companies tend to run on quarterly and annual cycles. Academia runs on a 1 year cycle, of which 9 months there's work and 3 months there's vacation. Unless you're a professor, associate professor trying to get tenure, and then the only thing you care about for 7 years is all the bullshit you have to go through to get tenure. That's not how startups work. That's not how entrepreneurs work. Entrepreneurs have to have a much longer view. They have to be on a mission. And the startup community has to transcend those other time cycles. It has to transcend the macro ups and downs. When the global financial crisis happened in 2008, the whole world of hierarchies was shaken to its core. Government was going to end, the financial system was going to end, the world was going to end. You couldn't get money out of ATMs, and therefore, the world's going to end again on December 21st, but the world was really going to end in 2000 in the fall. And so many entrepreneurs didn't notice. In Boulder, very few of us even noticed it was going on, because people were just getting up each day working on their companies. Yeah, there was a little impact from sort of the slowdown of spending in Q4 for big corporations and uncertainty and things like that. Most companies that were entrepreneurial companies just focused on what their businesses were, and some amazing companies got built in 2008, 2009, that were started in 2005, 2006, 2007. And their acceleration of their growth was spectacular. You're seeing many of the fruits of these companies now as companies that are either newly public or going public or sort of in the cycle of some very large successes. So this time frame is one that you have to have a very long-term view. The third principle is that you have to be inclusive of everyone who wants to engage in the startup community in any way. So if you think about a startup community, you think about the Boulder startup community, there's no president. There's no vice president of membership. There's no vice president of education. You don't have to get a license to be an entrepreneur. You don't have to join something. So you have to have this mindset of being completely and totally inclusive. You have to believe that it's not a zero-sum game that you're playing where there's winners and losers. And yeah, sure, there's some competition, and sure, there are situations where people rub each other the wrong way, and you have conflict. I mean, we're humans, we have kind of natural shit like that that happens. But as a startup community, if you approach it from the standpoint of being inclusive of anyone who wants to engage, regardless of their experience level, regardless of their age, regardless of where they came from, regardless of who they're related to and friends with and have worked for, whether they're moving to LA or leaving LA and going somewhere else, they're still connected. You're one giant network. And as a startup community, you actually should treasure people that leave to go somewhere else. Or if somebody comes, it should be simple for them to get engaged, because then they'll tell all of their friends, gosh, this was unbelievable. I showed up in LA and I thought it was this incredibly huge thing, and I found the startup community and boom, I was part of it. This notion of inclusiveness is so critically important. The fourth is that you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack on a continual basis. And I want to describe this because at some level this can feel kind of trivial, and any of the individual activities and events might be trivial. It's the compendium of them. It's the fact that they're happening all the time. It's that they're inclusive, that they're very broadly occurring is what's so important. I'm not talking about Entrepreneur of the Year awards. I'm not talking about cocktail parties where a bunch of people get together. I'm not talking about going to some rich, successful, famous entrepreneur's house and pretending to care what they did. I'm also not talking about guys like me showing up and talking to you. It's actually all the other stuff that's going on when people are interacting with each other that's so important. And it's things that actually engage you as a startup community. It's stuff like the 5 accelerators you have, which is phenomenal. Not that there's one accelerator here, but there's 5. And those 5 accelerators viewing it not as a zero-sum game where they're competing with each other, but where they're all playing a role. And they're playing a role in amplifying, growing, making the overall LA startup community bigger. It's a 90-day program like an accelerator where you actually engage not just with other entrepreneurs who are your peers, not just with investors, but with mentors who are existing, experienced entrepreneurs, people who are interested in what's going on in your business in this very concentrated way with a clear focus. It's Startup Weekend. How many people here have been to a Startup Weekend? Good, about half. Phenomenal simulation of entrepreneurship, which has the unintended consequence occasionally of spinning off neat companies. But even if it doesn't spin off a neat company, it's a great way to experience entrepreneurship if you're an aspiring entrepreneur. And if you're an existing entrepreneur looking for partners, it's a great place to find partners. I hear all the time, I'm looking for a technical co-founder, or I'm looking for a business co-founder. Great place to find those people, because these are other people who are showing up to work on starting a company. Oh, by the way, if you've got a company and you're an entrepreneur that has a business up and running, it's a great place to find people to come join your company, because these are all people who are trying to understand what entrepreneurship looks like. So 54 hours of activity that engages the entrepreneurial staff. In the book, I give about 20 examples of different kinds of activities like this. Again, any one of them is not enough. It's having them happening all the time. It's having everybody involved be completely inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. It's doing it over a 20-year period or longer. And it's being led by entrepreneurs. Somebody has an idea for a new thing they want to start. They don't have to get a license to start it. They just start it. So those are the 4 principles. I want to end with one other important construct, which is something we say all the time in Boulder, and is really fundamental to my way of thinking, and I think it's incredibly powerful in the context of a startup community, which is this notion of give before you get. Some people talk about it as pay it forward, but I like the phrase give before you get better. And let me define give before you get by separating two categories of people, an advisor from a mentor. And both advisors and mentors have a role in the world. But here's how they're different. An advisor says, I'll help you if you give me 1% of your company. Or I'll help you if you pay me a $5,000 a month retainer. A mentor says, how can I help you? A mentor has no expectation of what they're going to get out of the relationship. And in fact, the best mentor-mentee relationships are the ones where the mentor will say, and I can say this about many people I've been a mentor to, I've learned more from the people I mentored than they learned from me. So if nothing else, as a mentor entering into that kind of a relationship, you're selfish about it because you're probably going to learn from the person you're helping. The world needs a lot less advisors and a lot more mentors. And this notion in the startup community of playing a mentoring role, giving before you get, no matter what your experience level, is super important. Approaching it, not in an altruistic way, but in a way without expectation of what's going to come back, where you're investing energy in. The people that are in this room that have been entrepreneurs for a while, anybody who's been successful, I think most people are hard-pressed when asked the question, has anybody ever helped you without an expectation of getting something back? To say, no. I mean, most people have had somebody who's helped them as a mentor without an expectation. And some people have had many. And those best relationships are the ones that last for a very long period of time. And if you can embed that into the value system of the startup community, where you're not playing a zero-sum game, where you're being inclusive, where you're very, very focused on increasing what's happening. Think about LA and how big LA is, and how small the startup community is relative to the size of LA. You have so much more market share to get, if you want to think about it in that context. And then layer on top of it the notion that it is a very long-term journey. If you're expecting to have something magical happen in the next year or two, it could, but that's not the way to think about it. And oh, by the way, I don't know when, in 3 years, in 4 years, in 1 year, in 7 years, there's going to be a downturn. And entrepreneurship is going to be out of favor again like it was in 2002, and 2003, and 2004. Something else will happen that changes our view of stuff. That's okay. If you're taking a very long-term view, none of that really matters because you're continuing to build. So that's sort of my frame of reference. Again, the book goes much deeper into it, but hopefully, as I said at the beginning, this is obvious, and if it's not obvious today, hopefully it's obvious in a couple of years. I'd like to do Q&A and go wherever you guys want to go. Want to sit?
Over here, so if you want to ask a question, if you can kind of work your way up to the front. But in the meantime, while we wait for those folks, maybe you can talk a little bit about the myths. As our startup community grows, you start to hear things like, there's no capital here, it's hard to raise money here.
Yeah, so there's a whole section in the book about classical problems and myths, and let me highlight two of them I think that are important ones. One that you mentioned, which is that there's not enough capital here, and especially the myth that there's not enough venture capital here. It turns out that there's never enough capital. It turns out that it's always hard to raise money. Even when it looks easy, it's still not easy. And it might be easy at one moment in time for one entrepreneur, but it's never fundamentally easy. And so the idea that that's a constraint for you as an entrepreneur is an artificial constraint that you're creating. And it's actually not something that you can do that much about directly. In other words, if you're an entrepreneur, whining about there not being enough capital doesn't get you more capital. And, oh, by the way, there's not much that you can structurally do in the short term to get more capital, other than create compelling companies that then attracts capital. So there's a lot of different things that happen over the evolution of a startup community in terms of capital. And one of the dynamics is if you have, over a long period of time, an engaged startup community, you tend to get a lot more early stage capital into the community because much of that early stage capital doesn't come from venture capitalists, it comes from other entrepreneurs. And so it comes from other entrepreneurs who have made some money and turn around and reinvest it back into other local startups because that's fun, it's interesting, and it's something that a lot of entrepreneurs like to do. You also get to the place, if you think about capital today, you've got a bunch of seed funds in LA and a lot of early stage investors in LA. In 2007, there were no seed investors. I mean, like the whole idea of a seed investor existing was like a unicorn. And you had some angel investors, but you really didn't have very many seed investors. Today, there's a whole category. You know, there's too much seed investing, and now everybody's saying there's too many things being invested. It's just never in balance. So just don't give a shit about it. It's not something you can control. That's one myth. One of the classic problems that exists, and I'll describe it with a story, is something I talk about in the book called the patriarch problem. The patriarch problem, when I'm really grumpy, I call it the old white guy problem. And here's how it works. I went to Colorado Springs, which is about 2 hours south of Boulder, at the invitation of a couple of people that were entrepreneurs to come spend some time in their community and talk at the big angel group event and meet some entrepreneurs and talk at the university. And I said, sure, yeah, I don't want to come down just for the angel group event, so why don't you set up like 2 days worth of stuff, like a dinner and whatever, and I'll stay overnight and da-da-da-da. And I just left it in their hands. So here's what the arc looked like. The first night, I drove down, I show up, I'm at the nice hotel, beautiful evening, and a friend of mine that I know picks me up and drives me to one of the nicest houses in Colorado Springs, overlooking the whole town. And we have this beautiful dinner at this guy's house, beautiful house. And, I'm having dinner, and basically it's with about 20 people, somebody senior in government, I can't remember what their role is, the chancellor of the university, the president of the university, the local school, somebody from the mayor's office that's like the chief of staff, and then like 15 old white guys. All right, that's whatever. And there are, 2 or 3 entrepreneurs, and the rest were, the old white guy. And we have a nice dinner. We talk about, entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial community in Colorado Springs, and I hear about how there aren't enough good entrepreneurs, and the venture capitalists aren't here, and these guys want to invest money in things, but they have to go somewhere else to invest money because there's just not enough talent here in Colorado Springs, and da-da-da-da-da, and what should we do to solve for that? Next day, I do a bunch of meetings. I talk at the angel meeting, 300 people show up, how many people here have made an investment in the last 12 months? Like 4 hands go up. What the fuck are you doing here? This is angel group meeting, like 4 people made angel investments. Like, really? And I challenge them to like go do some stuff. Like stop with we're something we're not. I do some stuff at the university, I had some lunch with some entrepreneurs, do some more stuff. And at the end of the day I show up in Old Town, Colorado Springs, in an art museum, an art gallery with about 30 people. And they've got some local microbrews, and it's like the opposite of the dinner the night before. It's 20, 30 people, ethnicity pretty varied, about 50-50 male, female, all entrepreneurs, all except for one person, an entrepreneur, one person, again from the mayor's office, different person, younger person, and all between early 20s and late 30s. And we had this incredible conversation. The stuff that they were doing was just awesome. And a couple of one-person company, two-person company, a couple of people with one person with a 30-person company, one person with a 20-person company, but funded and growing very quickly. And we were talking, and I described my dinner the night before, and you could just see everybody, like the energy go out of the room. And somebody said, they knew about the people the night before. How do we get those people to pay attention to us? And I said, you don't, just ignore them. Just ignore them. A couple of things are going to happen. Number one, some of them are really cool and really awesome. And if you're doing cool stuff, they will notice you're doing cool stuff and they will show up. Because they want to do cool stuff with interesting people. So they'll notice something's going on and they'll just come to you. And then a couple of their friends will come hang out with them because that's where they're hanging out with, and they'll end up hanging out with you. And some of the rest of them won't do anything. But you know what? Those people are going to die anyway. What's the matter? You're not living. So don't worry about it. The patriarchs. They don't control what's going on here. And instead, just do what the internet does. Just route around them. And go create your own future. And they really got it. And it was very interesting to see, and this was 2 years ago or something like that, the energy level in Fort Collins. I gave a talk, or in Colorado Springs, I gave a talk via Skype a week or two ago. Unbelievable energy in a room full of people that 2 years earlier, 3 years earlier, you couldn't have found the people. And it was a mix of leaders and feeders. Some of the people in the room were the old white guys that had come down. I keep saying it that way just because I like to. A couple of patriarchs. Now I realize the irony of it becoming an old white guy, so I have to say it just to keep myself honest. But the patriarchs coming down off the top of the hill, a couple of them were in the room, a couple of the entrepreneurs in the room, a couple of people moved to town. Oh yeah, it's awesome what's going on here. Like you just see the energy level shift because you're not asking for permission. You're not waiting for somebody else to tell you it's okay.
There's the saying, JFDI. JFDI.
Just fucking do it.
At what point does the startup community reach the credibility where the word silicon does not need to be attached to it? And my second question, a little selfish. We are a small business, proudly. We've been around for 10 years. So overnight success, 10 years in the making. And my question is, at what point does your business no longer have the identity startup associated with it? So those are my two questions. Thank you, by the way.
Sure. So the first one, I think the word silicon blah, the phrase silicon blah is a terrible phrase. I think you do yourself a favor by deleting it immediately. Here's the fascinating thing. You already have a brand. Okay? There's a big brand, which is Los Angeles. There's a little brand, which is Santa Monica or Venice. I like to describe a startup community as a collection of neighborhoods. For those of you that know, say, Boston. Boston has not just one startup community. It's the Boston startup community, but it's really the Boston-Cambridge startup community. And it's really the startup community that consists of a bunch of neighborhoods, which include Kendall Square, Central Square, Harvard Square, the Innovation District, the Leather District, 4 Point Channel. I mean, different little communities. South End is the other one, sorry. So there's 6 neighborhoods that roll up into the community. Here you have, it sounds like Santa Monica, Venice Beach is one neighborhood. You have a burgeoning neighborhood in downtown. I don't know what it's called, but I know it's where
downtown.
It's called downtown. It's called Silicon Downtown. You asked the second question: when do you stop being a startup? So this is something you're going to hear a lot over the next couple of years. Phenomenal dynamics around startups and getting companies started in startup communities. We're now reaching a phase where many of these places that don't have that many startups are now starting to have a few that are scaling up and becoming more significant businesses. And, I like to say that at the point that the hierarchy takes over, you're no longer a startup. And you can still, take a company like Google, which has a hierarchy. I don't know how big Google is now, 40,000 people or something like that. Right? Is Google still a startup? Google's still a pretty young company. Right? It's only, 14 years old, 13 years old, something. And so you get into this definitional dynamic. And so the interesting thing that I think is going to happen is I think the word startup is a very good one right now. But I think we're going to start to get into this definitional dynamic where we have to talk about companies that are startups versus companies that are scaling up, or some other word. I've heard scale up a lot of times. The word gazelle is a word that came out of economic theory that's been around in government research. It's been around for about 15, 20 years. That word may stick, who knows. But this notion that as you're starting to grow more significantly, you're no longer a startup. It's also interesting that you can have lots of successful companies that don't grow that much. And in the lexicon of business, most of those companies historically have been called small business. And it's interesting, we had a problem, and I don't know if you guys pay attention to Startup America and what's happened there. There's two parts to it. One is a government initiative that was led by the White House, and one is a private partnership. The private partnership has done some pretty spectacular things. The government, White House initiative, did very little of substance. But the one thing that actually got done that was really impactful was they introduced a new phrase. And they introduced the phrase of high-growth entrepreneurs into the SBA. So the SBA is called the Small Business Administration and has been forever. It's not called the High-Growth Entrepreneurship Administration. It would have a lot more impact if it focused on high-growth entrepreneurs. There's nothing wrong with small business, but their needs are different. And so the dynamics between the two are starting to be understood in 2010, 11, 12, and I think over the next 5 or 10 years we'll really understand it as more people get their money.
So thank you for coming back to Noble City for your presence.
Oh. So will you tell my mother that? My mom's email address is Cecilia@Feld.com. She loves to get emails from me.
I'll tag you. So the federal government spends over $150 billion a year on basic science research and development. I'm a mentor with Founder Institute. I've seen hundreds of companies, and I just don't see any evidence that they're drawing on science. So I have a related question, which is how can we get more science into our startups and build on that competitive advantage? And also, you're one of the few people who could give a really great answer to this. What do you think that the differences are between Founder Institute and Techstars and basically the other kind of accelerators and incubators? What value do they add and what are they missing? How could they be better?
Okay, so let me answer the first, let me separate into two questions. Question one is how do we get more science into startups? And the second is what's the difference between Founders Institute, Techstars, Y Combinator, everything else? So on the first one, I will challenge your assertion that there's not a lot of science in startups. What I believe you have is you have a very messy landscape of startups. And if you try to force that landscape into a picture, it looks like so many other things, which is a pyramid. Right? You have a bunch of stuff at the base and less stuff as you go up. And the vector here is scientific complexity of the startup. I think it's good that you have a very, very broad base that has relatively low scientific complexity. Because much of what people are building when they're creating companies that have relatively low scientific complexity, even if they're successful or unsuccessful, is they're building muscle around how to have an idea and execute a product or an idea. And they build on that muscle over time, and they can apply that throughout their lives and throughout their careers. And that muscle, in and of itself, is important and valuable muscle as you work your way up the pyramid. The other thing I tell you is that there's some very interesting things that happen in very unexpected places, and I'll give you a very specific example. Techstars 2 or 3 years ago, two guys, Adam and Ian, had an application for a company called Gearbox. What Gearbox was they didn't know, but they wanted to play with robots. And so they made a video of them playing with robots. And when we did the application process, there's like always one or two things that's this, like right on the edge, like one or two people on the selection committee are really turned on and everybody else is like, that's stupid. This was one of those. And I'm like, we got to do this. This is just, it's robots. Like it's the first one we've seen that's that's hardware, that's something that's different than yet another software, web, mobile thing. But they have no idea what they're doing, okay? I signed up to be one of their mentors. They come in the second week of the program after meeting with all the mentors. They look very depressed. These guys are in their mid-20s. They're incredibly smart. One graduated college, one didn't. They're both hardware, software savants, mostly self-taught. And I said, you guys look, and I hadn't seen them the first week. You guys look down, what's up? And they're like, we don't know what to do. I'm like, well, what are your, we don't know what to create. What are your choices? He says, well, we have 3. Okay, what are the 3? Mumble, mumble, mumble. No, tell me each one. The first one, Adam says to me in deadpan, is a door lock that you can open and close with your smartphone. And it's kind of hard because door locks are kind of stupid technology and don't really work very well. And most aren't electronic anyway. But it's a really, door lock market's really big, and there's a lot of vendors who are talking to us about the door lock market. Okay, what's the second idea? I don't remember what the second idea was. That's how bad the description is. Ian, who doesn't talk very much, mumbles it. And I say, well, what's the third idea? And they kind of sheepishly both look at each other and they say, a robotic ball. I said, tell me more. And then, like, Adam just bursts out of his fucking skin. It's a ball, like we all have balls, we love to play with them, like roll them on the floor and throw them at each other and do stuff with it, but you control it with your iPhone, and you can roll it around with your iPhone. And I'm like, so tell me again why you're having trouble deciding what to do. I said, well, the ball thing, it's really, really hard. You have to like put a whole rocket control system in a little ball, and that's why there aren't any balls like this anymore. Nobody's ever done this before, but we figured out how to do it. But nobody thinks there's a market for it. Nobody can figure out why anybody would ever want a ball control with a smartphone, but it's a ball control with a smartphone. And I said to him, well, if you don't do the robotic ball, I'll just kill you. You have no choice. I mean, they knew that was what they... So they created a product, it's called Sphero. The company is now called Robotics. We went on to fund it, although we didn't fund it until after Techstars was over. They partnered up with a guy, Paul Barbarian, who has co-founded it with him, who's done a handful of companies that have succeeded and a handful that failed. The amount of technology they've created and the amount of science that they've stuck in this ball is remarkable. And it's technology that the reason you don't see remote control balls anywhere, especially ones that cost $129 in retail, is because it's extraordinary science. So it's happening in strange places that aren't so obvious. And oh, by the way, this didn't take 10 years and $100 million of government research to do in some Boeing something or other thing, right? It took $5 million and 15 people in an office in Boulder fighting with it for a year. So that's why I challenge that. I think it's happening in lots of different places, and I think it's spreading very quickly. But I don't think that there's bad about this base level being very broad. Other question you asked is the difference between different types of accelerators. I know Founders Institute some, so let me concentrate on Y Combinator, Techstars, Founders Institute. So the differentiation between Y Combinator and Techstars. Y Combinator is the first accelerator, Techstars is the second accelerator. Y Combinator runs on what I call a guru model. It's very centered around a relatively small number of partners who are instructing the entrepreneurs on what to do. And they get some smart other people around the system, but it's mostly the gurus that are telling you how to do it. With Techstars, we try to do the exact opposite. So the person running Techstars, any of the Techstars programs, is a guru. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to coordinate and surround the entrepreneurs with a bunch of mentors. And they're trying to make it mentor-led and mentor-driven, and engaging the entire startup community in whatever the city is, not just the mentors themselves, but the investors, the angel investors, in helping these entrepreneurs get their companies started. So kind of a very philosophically different approach. And many of the accelerators that have been created follow the mentorship accelerator model that we've worked really, really hard, not just to get right and understand and experiment with and figure out, but then to open source and publicize. So early on at Techstars, we decided our goal was not to have the only mentor-driven accelerator, but in fact, anybody that wanted to have a mentor-driven accelerator anywhere, we'd help them as much or as little as they wanted. And so we tell them how we did it, we'd share it openly, we open up the covers. There weren't any secrets. We publish all the data about the performance of all the companies. You go on Techstars' website, see every single company and what's happening to them today. So that model, I think there's probably a couple of hundred accelerators around the world that are using it. Founders Institute falls in a different category because it's not really an accelerator. It's a part-time education type program of which there's now a bunch of different ones. Whether it's GA, or whether it's programs that are happening in co-working spaces, GA being General Assembly. And I think that category is actually quite interesting, because in a lot of ways that's a lower commitment category. Right? You can take a course, you can engage in something part-time, you can do a startup weekend. You don't have to quit your job and go all in for 90 days, which you have to in a mentor-driven accelerator.
And so here in this community, which is similar to a general assembly, we see folks who come in here to learn, take a class. They may come in here and work. Sitting up front, I'm not sure where he went, was Hunter Gray, who, as they start to build their business, they then end up in an accelerator like Launchpad. They might end up back in this community. The borders, even inside our startup community, are very blurry.
So I talk about this specifically in the book. I use a phrase I call porous borders. So those of you that know chemistry, porosity is how easy it is to flow across a membrane. The more porous your borders, the better. This is, again, part of the not zero-sum game. This is part of the being inclusive. You want it to be easy. Oh, you were in Amplify. I don't want to talk to you. No. I was in Launchpad. Yeah. Like, you're having a similar experience. Or I'm a mentor for this program, so therefore I won't be a mentor for that program. Bad idea. Like, let it flow back and forth. Oh, I only have time to do one this year, so I'm going to do that one. But next year I'll do that one. Like let that kind of dynamic flow around. It's also good for you because it's good for everybody in the system, but it's especially good for the person that's moving around because of this creative dynamic. You get exposed to new ideas. You don't get stuck in the same rigid thinking.
Yeah, you talked about a lot of the participants in our startup community, from entrepreneurs to mentors, university, government. One that you didn't touch a ton on was service providers, and talking about how they are also a key part of our startup community. You'll see up there, TriNet, and we introduced Dan Friedland from Oric before.
How is Hollywood going to evolve, do you think?
You know, I don't know. I've never been a Hollywood insider, so my view of Hollywood is mostly through the movies they produce to try to brainwash me into understanding how Hollywood works. Like my view of Hollywood is like from the play or something. So I don't think I have a deep answer to the question. What I do know is, and we have investments that touch on, music and touch on the media industry, and I've had interactions in lots of different places, and we have investments in companies like Cheeseburger, that have some disruptive activity as well as some conformist activity, and some self-referential activity like the show that you just did on Bravo. So I have pieces of insight, but I don't have a sense of the wiring. What I do think is true from the outside looking in is, as an entrepreneur, you want to limit your dependency on any agency. So as an investor, there's a simple phenomenon called the agency problem that we try to, at Foundry Group, avoid investing in. The agency problem is where you have somebody between you and your customer, and you have to go through them to get to your customer.
I'm curious how many people are involved in startups that are trying to disrupt Hollywood in some way. I mean, it's obviously a real strength of ours to leverage domain expertise. So tonight, for example, one of the members of Cross Campus, John Cody, his company is TV4. They're filming tonight. And this is the 4th generation of television that's being created. And so, how do you solve the patriarch problem?
Can you swear on TV4?
Yes.
Can we? Yeah, all right. Thank you.
It's encouraged.
You're not swearing enough.
So fucking A. So, how do you solve the patriarch problem? You just fucking do it. That's it. And that's what's happening with these businesses and the hands that went up. I'm sure you're not going through Hollywood, you're just going right around it.
One more question.
From you or in general?
Hey, Brad. Thanks for coming. And when does Hollywood become like a detriment to the community? And, when you have these failed actors that come out here because they see like a gold rush, so to speak, and they get funding because they look good versus people that are scientists essentially over at Caltech come out here and can't achieve what they're trying to achieve? That's really the first part of that question. And then the second part is when you have these famous actors and things like that who put their names on it for essentially a return, but then at the same time, become that advisor where they want a percent, like you were saying, or a $5,000 retainer versus becoming a mentor. Like, how do you segregate between the two?
So in the first, which is how do you deal with the, I don't know what the right categorization of the problem is generically, but let's call it the poser or pretender problem, where somebody gets excited about being an entrepreneur because it's hip, trendy, and cool, and there's all of a sudden a rush of those into the system. People that really aren't committed to building a business or committed to going on a long-term journey. Time solves that. And that's why you have to think about it with a 20-year plus lens, is that none of those people are able to sustain their pretend activity for very long. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3, but the vast majority of that goes away. And it happens very quickly, and it happens often very quietly because of the ego dynamics of the people involved. So it's one of these things where, you kind of all of a sudden notice it, and then you all of a sudden notice it went away if you're a serious entrepreneur and you power through. And as a startup community, it's just noise and histrionics, and frankly, it's kind of entertaining, and sometimes it's a little amusing, to be adjacent to it, but don't get wrapped up in it. That's part one. Part two is I'll ask the second part of your question again, because I was going to say something else, but then I realized it wasn't the question. I'll make sure I get the second part of the question.
So one thing I've noticed is that when I first came up with the startup...
Oh, the advisor. So I'm a movie star, and I'm going to invest in your company, but I also want a little extra big because I'm a movie star, and if I lend my name to your company, then I should get
It's not really invest in the company, because a lot of people that, they don't even put any money.
Yeah, you can say I'm associated with your company if you give me some blah, blah, blah. So thing number one as an entrepreneur, resist temptation. Like, ask yourself the question, am I going to get anything useful out of this? And if the answer is probably not, then don't. So, some of it is just the entrepreneurs getting sucked into that dynamic. Now, there's a lot of people, I like to say that if you're hiring VP of sales, that's the hardest role to hire a lot of times, because people who are VPs of sales are often very good at selling themselves, even if they suck at selling, right? They're good at selling the best product. As an entrepreneur, as a CEO of a company, as a leader of a new startup, don't get blinded by somebody that's got some fame or some flash, or that talks about how they can help you with something. Check it out. Make sure that they've done it before. Ask them for an introduction to the 5 other people that they've done work with before, and ask those people if it's actually useful. Same thing with a venture capitalist. I'm a great investor. I'm going to be a value-added venture capitalist. The second somebody says something like that, they're full of shit. Like, why do you have to describe what you're doing with action? I'm going to be value-added. If you have to tell me that, just show me that. Don't tell me that. And so it's the same kind of thing. Get into a mode where people are showing you what they're going to be doing for you rather than telling you what they're going to be doing for you. And be skeptical. It's very easy as an entrepreneur to be optimistic about everything. And just make sure you have a skeptical filter that applies to anybody that asks you for something before they do something for you.
Thank you.
Give before you get. I think that's a wonderful note to close on. So I just want to thank Brad again. Please give it up.
I have a couple of requests I'll just end on. One is, I give you my email. I think I gave it earlier, but if not, it's brad@feld.com. If there's something I can do to be helpful, just email me. Remind me that I was here. Keep it short, be direct, but if there's something that is in my world that overlaps with your world, or you have a question, or I said something stupid, or I said something that needs clarification, it's how I learn. So if you hear something tonight, or heard something tonight that didn't make sense to you, if it offended you, I'm sorry. Don't bother me about that. But no, I'm joking. If there's anything that didn't make sense or that didn't feel right, I'm open to it. For those of you that read the book and are so inclined, every aspiring author always loves more reviews on things like Amazon and Goodreads. If you liked the book, leave a review and tell people. And if you didn't like the book, just please don't tell anybody. But thanks for having me. It's really fun.
So everyone gets a book. Brad, you're going to stick around and
Yeah,
sign it?
I'll stick around for a while and sign it for people that want that.
Okay, so you'll be able to pick up your book, Blair, where?
At the reception desk where you came in.
So maybe we'll set up a spot up there
I'll
that
just
you
sit
can
over by the
sign.
books and sign them.
Okay, awesome.
All
Thanks,
right,
Brad.
thanks.